So we keep hearing a lot about NATO at the moment in the news, and it's probably confusing as why so many of the member states are reluctant to get involved with the US operations in Iran. So it's really important for us to actually strip back what NATO was set up for, how it was used, say, until the end of the Cold War, how it was used between the end of the Cold War and currently, and whether or not it's actually fit for purpose anymore. So just to give a little bit of context, at the end of World War II, you've got the Allies moving across Western Europe, and then you've got the Soviet Union moving across Eastern Europe, meeting in the middle, roughly in the vicinity of Berlin. And so Germany was split into two, with half going to the Allies, half going to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been essentially up-armed, supplied, equipped by the US and by Britain with the convoys. And it was almost as if they'd let the genie out of the bottle, because there was a realisation or a fear that Stalin was just going to continue across the plains of Europe and try and seize all of Western Europe as well. And you even had General Patton on the US side saying that, trying to implore Eisenhower to continue pushing the US right into the heart of Moscow, because essentially they realised that that was going to become the next threat. Now, that didn't happen. Instead, the Cold War started. But this was why NATO was formed, with that singular purpose of defence against this emerging threat of the Soviet Union. And it was essentially designed that if one member state was attacked, the others would all come to its aid. Now, aid's the key point of this, because whilst that was the principle behind Article 5, which states that an attack on one member state is an attack on all, crucially, how the member states respond is the aid bit, rather than it being automatic declarations of war. But for us to really truly understand what NATO was there for, we have to understand the context as well of where armaments had moved on to by this point. So this was the start of the nuclear age. The US had dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union had managed to acquire the nuclear bomb quite soon after the US had. So both sides had the capability to destroy each other completely, and there was what was called an arms race. And nuclear proliferation saw literally tens of thousands of nuclear devices being built and stored on either side of the Cold War. And this led to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, acronym MAD. And it literally was mad, because the logic was very simple and very terrifying. And this is what all of our parents, grandparents would have had to have lived through throughout probably their whole lives. If one side launched nuclear weapons, the other would automatically respond and both sides would be wiped out. That was the logic. That was why it was mad. There would be absolutely no winners, just a nuclear holocaust. And we came so close to that happening several times. The most famous incident being the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it was literally moments before that nuclear Armageddon starting. Fortunately, people were able to back down. But that reality, that nuclear conflict, or the potential of a hot nuclear conflict, was what shaped everything, all of the NATO doctrine. NATO was never meant to fight a war, it was meant to prevent one. And so even the British Army on the Rhine was literally dug in across northern Germany, and their role was, when the Russian tanks or Soviet tanks were coming across the plains of Europe towards them, they knew that they would be completely wiped out. But their role was to hold them up just long enough that the nuclear bombs could be launched. And then you'd have stay behind observation posts, which would then be able to guide nuclear missiles onto the sort of advancing forces. It was really serious, zero-sum game, tactics and strategy in this. The cost of a war was so unthinkable that that's what deterred it from happening. In the United Kingdom itself, it wasn't theoretical. We had, because we were still incredible at engineering at the time, we had the V-Force, which was, the Vulcan bomber, the Victor, the Valiant. They were our nuclear bomber fleet, and they were kept at constant readiness across the country, either in the air or at short notice readiness. And then also, you may not even be aware of this, we had what was called the Royal Observer Corps, and they were dug into tiny little two-man bunkers literally across the whole of the landscape of Britain, and then they'd just be on an ongoing rotation. And their role was, when a nuclear attack occurred on Britain, it wasn't about stopping it, it was that everything's going to be destroyed, and to work out where the bombs had fallen Yeah, the observer corps would be able to tell how big the mushroom cloud was. Now, obviously, if they were near the epicenter of the detonation, they would not be observing anything. So wherever the observers were that could observe it, it meant that it hadn't gone as far as them, and then they could work out like the kilotonnage of the devices, which cities had been wiped out, and then work out like the response. Because this was, like I say, it was literally deterrence through this mad doctrine of just completely wiping everything out. And so ultimately, these guys would be there in their little bunkers, and then at the end of the Cold War, that all kind of got wound up. And I'm sure there's still bunkers all across the country that you'd probably be able to go and find. And, Royal Observer Corps, Google them, fantastic, really incredible sort of story there. But it was they were there literally to monitor the aftermath rather than, defend against anything. And as I said, the Cuban Missile Crisis was where we came that close to Armageddon. The world literally stood on the brink of nuclear war. And if there was one misstep, one miscommunication, that would have been the end of it. But that's why NATO worked. During the Cold War, it acted as that bulwark against the Soviet Union. And it deterred aggression, not by fighting, but by making the consequences that drastic. And then all of a sudden, 1991, Soviet Union collapsed. And that was pretty much the end of the Cold War. But while some people were banging on saying that this was the end of history, actually things became a lot more complicated. You see, and certainly for NATO, it had achieved its aim, it had served its purpose. The enemy it was built to contain no longer existed, and at that point, there was a choice. It was either dismantle the NATO alliance and build something new designed for this new era, or adapt what was already existing and make it, fit however we were going to use it in the future. It was designed or decided that NATO was going to adapt. And so it expanded its membership and it started to include these former Eastern Bloc countries that had now been released from the clutches of the Soviet Union. And it began to take on new roles as well. So there was crisis management, counter-terrorism, interventions beyond its traditional geographic scope, which was, the North Atlantic, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. So it started to operate in the Balkans, it started to operate in Afghanistan, which was our big sort of undertaking in Afghanistan was a NATO mission. It was in Libya. And its role shifted purely from this defensive posture to something broader, what you'd essentially call influence building. But here's the issue with that. The structure remained the same. The articles remained the same. The legal foundation was built around collective defence, but it was no longer being used for collective defence. So you end up with this gap between what NATO is on paper and how it operates in reality. And at the same time, the alliance became increasingly reliant upon the United States. The United States has been providing at least 2/3 of the funding for NATO, pretty much since its inception. And while, say, in the Cold War, a lot of the other countries, Britain included, were, carrying a lot more of the weight, since the end of the Cold War, they had this idea in Europe, certainly, that there was something called the peace dividend, i.e., let's not spend as much money on our defence anymore because actually, the main aggressor has gone away. And that's why we found ourselves in Western Europe now with chronically underfunded militaries and disenfranchised troops, whilst the US has continued to fund at the same levels. The US has been, continuing to spend on defence, intelligence, the nuclear deterrence, without which we'd be, reliant purely on Britain and France. And this imbalance has essentially created this situation where most of the countries benefit from the security umbrella of the US without actually contributing proportionately the same amount. And over time, of course, that's going to, build a resentment. It's going to build a sense of frustration. Because at the end of the day, the United States doesn't need to be funding the defence of Europe. It could just sort of sit on the other side of the Atlantic and look after itself. And so from that perspective, NATO is actually a shared commitment. But then from the other, it starts to look like a system where one country, the United States, carries all of the burden whilst everyone else is just essentially taking the piss. And that brings us to where we are today. The US arguably believes that if it's been funding the collective defence of Europe for all this time, actually that should buy it a little bit of influence and a little bit of support when it wants to do something. So that brings us to today. The US has taken action in Iran and NATO members have hesitated to support it. Why? Well, because under the NATO treaty, it's a defensive alliance, and the member states are not obliged to support offensive or unilateral military action. If a member isn't attacked, then legally Article 5 doesn't apply. So countries stepping back aren't actually breaking the NATO rules, they're following them. But that exposes something quite important. NATO is not a unified military force under US command. It is a collection of sovereign states, each acting within its own interests within a shared framework. So then when you get these figures like President Donald Trump who question NATO or threaten to pull out of it, it starts to reflect that imbalance that we've talked about. One country paying the lion's share of the funding for it, everyone else benefiting from it. And the argument from the American side is simple. If the US is providing the majority of the capability, why shouldn't it expect a favour or alignment in return? And the reason for that is that NATO is no longer serving its original function. So they're looking ahead. We now start to realise that the US is potentially going to pull away from it. And so whilst NATO would still exist, countries like the UK, France and Germany would remain and collectively would still represent a significant economic and military power, but it would be a very different alliance. It would go back to being focused just on regional defence in Europe rather than this global influence role that it's taken on since the end of the Cold War. And it would also lack the same level of nuclear deterrence because, like I say, you've only got two countries in the membership that would actually have the nuclear capability. Intelligence capability would be reduced and, albeit the British have still got a solid sort of intelligence infrastructure, it wouldn't be the same as having the US on board as well. And then most definitely in terms of the rapid response capability, so it could still defend itself, but it would take time to adjust. And, it's almost going back to square one of this threat of the Russian hordes, charging across the plains of Europe. But ultimately, it would no longer have the global reach that saw it going into the Balkans, going into Afghanistan, etc. And similarly, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden relations with the US would completely disappear. You'd still see continued cooperation like intelligence sharing, joint operations when interests align, but more on a transactional basis rather than this binding alliance that you've had up until now. And all of this is happening in a world that's rapidly changing. We've got China on the rise, we've got the reassertion of Russia, the United States looking more inward, doing what's in its interests, and you start to then create this multipolar world with at least 4 key players. And NATO was built for a singular, laser-like operational focus, a unified Western bloc defending collectively against the threat of the Soviet Union. And this ultimately leads us on to the central issue of all of this. NATO was highly effective at what it was designed to do. It prevented a catastrophic nuclear war through deterrence and unity until the end of the Cold War. But instead of ending the alliance when the mission was complete, it started to evolve without changing its structure or fully defining its purpose. And it now sits in this uncertain position where it's still powerful, still relevant in some contexts, but increasingly stretched between its original principle of collective self-defense of Western Europe or the West and its modern use as this influence tool. And that's why you start to see these tensions rising, because when an alliance is built on shared purpose, but then starts operating in a world of competing interests, the question isn't just whether it works, it's whether it still knows what it's for.